Olina ho kako, aloha mai. O wau no ka imiloa haka kawapuna kahula Christmas. No wau I ke awa I ka mainland, moku o Alikona, o Cottonwood ke kauna. And what I've said in Hawaiian is I'm ka imiloa Christmas. I live on the mainland now. I lived for a long time in Hawaii. In Arizona and in a town called Cottonwood. And so this is what we're going to talk about today, Hawaiian fishhooks and how you make them. So let's go at it. The first thing we need to talk about is what did they make the fishhooks out of? What was the biggest mammal in Hawaii? Where did they get the bones? How did they work the bones or the shell? The other things, wood sometimes that they used for fishhooks. And how about shark hooks? How about big hooks for ulua or for sea bass and things like that? What about the two-piece hooks that they developed? They had some really amazing things. When the first foreigners came to Hawaii, of course, the sailors were used to fishing off the ship for years. And they found that the Hawaiians could stand on the railing of the ship and catch fish right and left with their bone hooks. And they weren't catching much at all with their modern iron hooks. So to start off with, I made these plaques for teaching a long time ago. And so what we're looking at here is possible things to make the hooks with, bone hooks with, or shell hooks. So here we've got possible human bone, we'll talk about that, and some part of a dog's tooth, some turtle shell, and a bird bone, maybe a pig bone, possibly a dog bone, and pearl shell. So those were the things that the Hawaiians had to make the hooks out of. And the big hooks for sharks we'll talk about separately. So what about the human bone? We've got to take ourselves back to the old times in Hawaii. We can't use our modern concepts of morality and what should and shouldn't be done. And instead, we've got to think about what it was like to live in those days. So they didn't have any big mammals. They didn't have any elk and deer, buffalo, anything like that. The biggest mammal they had was us. So the best fishhooks, the biggest fishhooks, the thickest ones, the two-piece ones, were made out of human bone. And the best place on the human was right there, the tibia. The main bone of the lower leg has a flat on it, and so do some animals have flats on their bones. And that's the perfect place to make the fishhooks from. So yes, they did, and so that's one reason that the chiefs were very, very carefully cared for as far as their iwi when they were put away safely. One of the reasons that just the bones were retrieved and wrapped in tapa and then hidden away was because that could be done in secret. You could put a chief's bundle of iwi under your kihei and carry it out at night, and no one would know you were carrying that, and hide it away much more easily than they could with a body. And the chiefs in particular, because of their mana, everyone was worried that their bones would be taken and used by fishermen to catch fish, because they thought they would catch more fish if they had more mana. So they wanted the bones of a real good fisherman, for instance, or the chiefs and so on. And so that was the reason for those care of the iwi, part of the reason for the care of the iwi, because yes, they did sometimes dig up old graves and get the bones, crack them up, and use them for fishhooks. So what about the different fishhooks and how they made them? The Hawaiians had some really remarkable things, and they had a two-piece fishhook, which was even the more remarkable. But if you had some of these materials, thick turtle shell, they had some real thick turtle shell, sometimes more than 1/8 of an inch thick, or piece of human bone, or dog or pig bone, possibly, that wasn't as good, or heavy bird bone, maybe from the ground birds that used to live in Hawaii, and their bones were sometimes found in caves, or a pretty good piece of pearl shell. You could make all kinds of things if you knew how to do it. So this is how they would make the bone fishhooks. They'd rough out a shape, and we'll talk about the tools that are used to rough it out. And then they used a pump drill, a thing called a nauwili, to drill holes in advantageous places in the bone. So they'd start like this with a blank, like this or like this. Drill a little starting spot, maybe with just a little hand drill like this, just a little piece of basalt, something where they could just get a start in the bone, possibly a real hard piece of shell like this that they'd sharpened into a chisel point like that, and then just turn it by hand to start where they wanted the hole to be. And then they were going to use the nawili to drill the hole deeper. Here we've got 3 of them, and here we've got just 1 of them, and start to rough out the blank to the shape of the fishhook. So here it is. Now it's been drilled from both sides, because with a pump drill with a tapering drill tip, you have to drill from both sides until you puka through, until you punch through, and then you begin to enlarge that hole. So here we are shaping the fishhook further, like so, and a little further, and then all the way to this. So this would be a simple little straight pull type of fishhook, and this is what they call a rotating fishhook or a jaw type fishhook. And these were actually created for a specific fish. They would design the fishhook to fit the jaw structure of a specific fish. When they took the bait and they pulled the line, it would actually lock onto their jaw, just like what these barbs are here for. So this wasn't meant to hook the fish like this is. It was meant to catch the fish by grabbing onto its specific anatomy, the bones in its mouth. So what about that pump drill? That's what this is right here. So this is the nawili. It's got 3 parts. Well, it's got some cordage too, but it's got a crossbar like this. It's got a flywheel like this, and then it's got a vertical shaft like this, which is tapered off at the end, maybe about a 30-degree angle down here. And then some kind of tip is put on here that's hard enough to drill. So when you get to shell, it's got to be pretty hard. Bone, not too bad. Wood, it'll really drill wood. And very fine Olana cord, which was specific to Hawaii, and we've talked about that before, was used to lash these on here. So the principle of this is the flywheel. So if you wind this up like this, right, and we spin this, it's going to keep spinning. So if I push down firmly, it spins, and then I let go. Push, 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 push. And I could do this sideways or up or down, whatever, even upside down. But what that does is drill a hole. And of course it drills a conical hole because of the shape of the drill. It's not like a modern cylindrical drill. It's a tapered point. And so that's what makes the nawili work. So an old one that somebody found in a cave where it had been burned, it had a flywheel a little bit bigger than this, about as big as the full size of my palm and a little bit bigger, and about 1 inch thick was wood. The shaft was about this size right here, tapered off at about a 30-degree angle down at the bottom, but it had been burned somehow. I don't know why, but anyway, it certainly taught me some things. So these pump drills were in eastern Polynesia and the eastern part of central Polynesia, along with a couple of other things, gourds, the membrane top drum, and the bow and arrow. Those things were known in eastern Polynesia, eastern part of central Polynesia, and not further on to the west, like in Samoa, Tonga. Fiji, they had the bow, but the pump drill, they didn't have it, and the Maoris were the last Polynesians to migrate and went down to Aotearoa, New Zealand. They didn't have this. So somehow in the last 800 years or so, these things came into eastern Polynesia, and all 4 of those things are from the mainland. So how did they get there? The Polynesians probably were the ones that went to the mainland and brought those things back, but it's possible that somebody from the mainland, by accidental voyaging or purposeful voyaging, actually got out into the Pacific too. So the nawili was really useful for all kinds of drilling purposes, making canoes, any other kind of holes that you wanted to make. But once you got the hole like this, and you wanted to round it out better, say you had made a hole in a cowrie shell to make an octopus lure, and you had knocked a little hole in there, but you wanted to round out the hole. This kind of shell from Hawaii, tiny little shell, real pointy, but the ones that have a real rough little ridges on them here, you can put that in a hole in a shell, at least like a cowrie shell, and just turn it, it'll round it right out as if it was made with a modern drill. So what else did they use to make fish hooks? This is the molar of a dog. So these are known. I mean, things like this have been found from the past in Hawaiian archaeological sites. And so if you're clever enough, you can find enough meat inside of that dog's tooth to actually make a little bitty hook. And that's why I cut it part way so you could see, part of you could still see the tooth, and then you could see the hook that I've created within that tooth. Now that would be a real piece of work in the old times when you didn't have a Dremel tool or any of the tools that we've got today. That would be an amazing piece of work. So what about if they were going to use a two-piece hook? I'm going to hold that for a second and show you this plaque. So here we've got a big piece of bone. Now, a piece of bone that big in Hawaii would have been a piece of human bone. No question about it. The dogs and pigs weren't going to provide a thick piece of bone that big. So if you cut the bone like this, you've got to use something like this. A piece of basalt. So a big boulder falls off the cliff, it hits some basalt down below, and it chips off a good flake, and you get lucky enough to find one like that. And if you saw with that in the bone slowly from each side, you can get it thin enough that you can hit it and break it. And another way that you can work bone like that is to use a pump drill, the nawili, and drill a whole series of small holes, all close together, a whole series of right down a line. Get it, fair halfway through the bone maybe, and then you take a hammerstone and you just keep pecking all along that line, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and you create little micro fractures in the bone, and eventually you can get it to break right along the line that you wanted it to break at. So this shows one piece and the other piece of a two-piece fishhook, and this is what resulted from that. Something like this. So they'd have two pieces. Oftentimes the back part was made of wood like this one, because they find a lot more of this part than they find of this part in archaeological digs. And so we know that they made a lot of them with the back part here out of wood. So down here at the bottom, there's a couple little ears, and that's so you can wrap it with the real strong Olana cord and bring those pieces together. Sometimes they put a little wedge of wood or bone right in here under the wrapping to stiffen this place right here. But it just made one heck of a hook, because you didn't have to worry about the grain of the bone down here going through this curve where it might snap off. Instead, you had some good linear grain through both pieces and joined right here at the bottom. Sometimes they even had little mortise joints in here, very sophisticated stuff to make it fit together better. So that's a two-piece fish hook, and virtually no place else had that except Hawaii. So how about the shell? Oh, I forgot this. This is something else I wanted to tell you about. So this is the canine tooth of a dog, right? So they've actually found these things in archaeological sites too. And so here's a piece, I hope the camera can see that, where they've marked off the frontal part of one of these two-piece fish hooks to make out of the core part of the dog's canine. Because right underneath the enamel here and this whole part back here in a mature tooth is solid. It's like real good bone, almost like ivory. And so they actually use that at times. Here's some other pieces of bone that I've brought just from here where I live. So this would be a real good deer bone. And we can see it's real nice and thick. It's good dense bone, but it doesn't have any big flat spots. You really couldn't make any big fish hooks with this bone. It just doesn't have near the expanse that they used in Hawaii when they were using human bones like the tibia. So we're horrified by those things today because of our upbringing, our morals of today. But if we put ourselves back in the old times, and you had to live and you had to feed yourself and your family in the village, then you had to use whatever there was in your environment to make the things that you needed to make. So yes, some human bones were sometimes used for other things, to ridicule somebody. Maybe we could talk about that sometime. Or to honor and praise somebody. So it's very different than many other societies. So here's something important. This bone is drying out and it's starting to crack on its own, right down its own grain structure. It's got a crack here and a crack here. So if you use little wedges, I don't think I brought one of my wedges, but if you've got a small basalt wedge, just run it in here and then tap it with with a wooden mallet or with a hammer stone and coax the bone to split, following some of its own natural lines. So that's another way that the bones were split. And then just pounding bones, just get the bones and get a hammer stone, and just beat on the bones and see how they break up. And now and then you'll get real good pieces that are just right for making a fish hook. This is probably an elk bone. You can see it was old and weathered. It's probably something I found out in the field somewhere. But it's good. I mean, it's got some real good thickness here. But they didn't have anything like that. They didn't have any cows, any horses, any burros, elk, buffalo, nothing in Hawaii. No big mammals. And they didn't use seals, curiously enough. I don't know why, but they didn't. So the basalt saws, like I talked about, here's one that I took a piece, where something had fallen off a cliff, or a great big flake had fallen off, and then I took a hammer stone and chipped it some more to make it a more even edge. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Not too narrow, but pretty good. And then I had another one here. This is one that probably I split a real good piece of basalt, and it's really got a good edge, real good edge. So what was that for? It's for sawing the bone. If you're trying to saw grooves to make the bone split, or you're trying to do the shaping like I showed before, the basalt saws are really helpful. So that's good for working bone. And then how do you shape the bone? Well, one of the things you need is, just like when you're shaping wood, you've got different kinds of stones with different grit characteristics. So this would be real coarse, mostly for shaping wood, and then pretty fine, rough. Something that really grabs your finger when you rub it. This will be real good on bone. It's pretty fine, but it's got a lot of rough places. Then here's one that's a little finer. Again, it feels real rough to your finger. And one that's even finer. So you can work your way down with bone or wood to finer and finer finishes. And finally you get down to something like this that's pumice. So pumice has a really fine surface. I'd say this is about like 150 grit sandpaper. And then they had lots of other things that they could use as sandpaper too for fine work. And we'll talk about that when we make a video about woodworking. So the other thing that was really, really important with doing bone work was coral files. Coral files, just like that. So if you go to the beach where it's thrown up a lot of white coral, and you've got some pretty flat lava anywhere around there, you can pick up a piece of white coral, the softer kind, and rub it on the lava, and in about 5 minutes you can make a basic rasp. This is a much finer one. It probably took me about 20 minutes to make that one. Flat here, tapered real good like this. This is a real good one. This would have been kept wrapped up in top of, maybe in a little lauhala cover or something like that. But you'd be amazed what you can do with bone with a coral file. All this shaping in here, the real fine shaping, you use a big sea urchin spine. Final finishes on wood and things we'll talk about with when we have wood polishing and things talking. This is another thing I think might have been used at times, maybe for real fine work, maybe real small barbs and things, just to get them started at least. That's a stingray barb mounted in a handle. But the stingrays have lots of little fine teeth on the edge of them. And this I found very useful in making tattooing tools with bone, and even making the grooves like in a real hardwood kawila tapa beater. That really works. It's very hard to find one that's pretty straight, but these teeth last a long time. They're really tough. So let's talk about the shell a little bit. This one is interesting. I made that just because they actually had things like that in Tahiti. They didn't have any like this in Hawaii. And so were they an ornament or were they really a useful hook? I'd say both. Probably used as an ornament and also strong enough to use as a hook. Because how are you going to get a great big sea bass or something like that? What are you going to use as a hook? This one obviously is made to slip around the jaw of the fish and then catch on the jaw, some kind of a big fish. So the black-lipped pearl oyster is what we've got in Hawaii and down in Tahiti and the Tuamotus to the east of Tahiti. So it's black on the outside and then pearl shell on the inside, the mother of pearl on the inside. So if we look at the edge of it, we can see how much of the white pearl shell is there. And the Hawaiian hooks were usually made just with this stronger white part, and oftentimes little borers, all the little borers that are all over the place in the sea and get into canoe hulls and ship hulls and every other thing, even all the shells. They'll often bore all around on the outside of a pearl shell that has died. And so they would work it down, work it down, work it down, get rid of all the little pukas so there'd be less chance, the pukas would be in holes, less chance of it breaking. They wanted to have an even surface like this. So this is what I used, a great big pearl shell. So one this big and this thick would be unlikely to grow in Hawaii. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if we look at the edge of it, in here, it's got, I don't know if you can see that, but it's got at least 1/8 of an inch of thickness of the white pearl shell here. And then when you get up near the hinge joint of the shell, that's where it's really thick. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Why do you need that thick part? So I cut that out. I don't remember what, probably some little special blade on my bandsaw or something to cut that out and make that. But what about in the old days? How did they do that in the old days? And what did they do it with? So I got a pearl shell and I started working on it. This is probably about as big as they got in Hawaii. This is a gold lip pearl shell, like from down in Australia and near New Guinea and so on, northern Australia. So I was trying to cut this here and here. So what you need to do is cut this groove all the way in and then cut this groove deep enough on both sides that you can snap it off. So I worked with that. What can you do? The basalt doesn't work worth a darn. And I finally got to obsidian. Volcanic glass, you get a pretty good edge on obsidian, but it's just hard and smooth enough that it works pretty good. Just scratching back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You can feel it when it's working because it scratches. And so I got partway through on both sides, pretty close to where I could snap it on, almost through here, 3.5 hours, sitting around with a piece of obsidian scratching on this pearl shell. So you can imagine how valuable those pearl shell hooks were to the old Hawaiians, why they put them in a special container, the fishermen that would float, why they were so precious to them. So difficult, easily broken, but beautiful, beautiful hooks, especially for the small little hooks. So I mentioned about how big the pearl shells were in Hawaii. This one's interesting because the outer lip here, let's see if we can see a little of that somewhere. No, I didn't bring one, but the outer lip here is beyond where the creature is living. The pearl shell is where the creature is living. The outer lip here is just kind of a protective area, but it's all been broken off here. So in Hawaii's waters, they're far enough north that the pearl shell doesn't grow very good in Hawaii. It's hard to get a good thick pearl shell in Hawaii. Down in Tahiti or the Tuamotu Islands off to the east, it's easy. You get tons of pearl shells, you get some real big ones. But in Hawaii, it was harder until one time I was at a cultural event and a woman came by and said, she was telling me some other things that she was reminded of that her grandfather taught her about. But she lived down south of Kailua Kona on the Big Island. And she said, I just remembered when I was little, my grandfather told me that if we were diving in the ocean and we ever saw a pearl shell on the bottom, but it had stones around it in a circle, we were not to take it because that marked it as somebody's shell. They were trying to grow bigger until they could finally use it for fish hooks or to make a aku lure, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what they were told to do was to not take it, but to go down and break off this edge of the shell. Now that just sounds crazy, doesn't it? Why would their grandfather tell them to break off the edge of the shell? Because when you do that, if you let the shell get up to big enough size where you can make something out of it, and then you keep breaking off the edge of the shell periodically, it makes the shell get thicker and thicker here because it can't grow outward anymore very well. So it gets thicker here. I never heard of such a thing. It's not in the books that I know of, just oral history that I happen to luck out and hear. But I thought that was really, really interesting about what they did in a place like Hawaii, where the water's a little too cold and the pearl shells don't want to grow. But they sure had the pearl shells, and they made the idol eyes and things. I don't know, you can't see this over here, but for the Lono image and lots of other images had pearl shell eyes, so they had to have pearl shells to make that. And then they made all kinds of smaller fish hooks out of pearl shells. And they also made the pahiaku. That's what that's called right there. Pahiaku. So the pa is the pearl shell part, and he was the hook, and the aku, of course, is the bonito. It looks like a small tuna. So they're in schools, they come in near the shore sometimes, and you can go out with a canoe. Real stout bamboo rod, real stout olana cord in one of these, and if somebody's paddling the canoe back and forth through the fish, the water's just boiling where the fish have been pushed up, the bait fish have been pushed up by a school of aku, and you throw this out behind the canoe, and it's skipping around amongst the bait fish, and bam, they grab that. So they had to make this bone, use some kind of bone to make this type of hook here. They use sennet from the coconut for this part, or olana, the real strong cordage. A little bit of pig bristle here to keep it from spinning around. It would make it skip on the surface. But look how thin this is. This, no doubt, is Hawaiian pearl shell. It is really, really thin. It's still got the black part here. The shiny part's over here, but it was from a pretty small pearl shell. And that was gifted to me by Umi Kai, who's a craftsman friend of mine on Oahu, who does incredible cordage and work like this. So I was very, very touched by that and very grateful for that gift. But it illustrates to us what the Hawaiians had to work with, because if we go down in the South Seas, they've got lures like this. This is where that hinge part is of the shell, but look how thick this thing is. This is some real thick turtle shell here as the hook. Some kind of modern cordage. And then here's another one, similar, but here again we're getting a little thinner, but this is the hinge part of the shell. So same thing again, they used turtle shell, whereas Hawaiians would have used bone for this right here. Same thing, it's just a lot bigger, and the Hawaiians didn't have big ones like that. They just didn't have big enough pearl shells. So then we're going to go to the shark hooks. So the typical shark hook was like this. I made this a little bit oversized, but it illustrates what the Hawaiians had. So their shark hooks were unique. Nobody else had shark hooks as good as the Hawaiians had. Up here, instead of a knob or some kind of other projection where they could lash it onto a cord, they had grooves like this. And down here, they actually cut a mortise, cut a slot in the wood down here, and shape whalebone until it would fit into that mortise, and then make a little groove right here in the wood and use that incredible cordage called olana to lash it into place. And now you had a hook that would really penetrate the jaw of the shark, and it didn't get dull. So did Hawaiians go after whales? No, they weren't whale fishermen. The Maoris were. Other peoples in the world were, but not the Hawaiians. They waited until a dead whale would wash up on the shore somewhere, and whatever chief owned that kind of land was a very wealthy chief, because this was so valuable. So the teeth were valuable to make Hawaiian things like the palawa ornament and other ornaments. And then the whalebone was used for that, or like this. There's a few known specimens of hooks made out of whalebone like that. So a long time ago, somebody gifted me a piece of whalebone. No doubt it was something that was found on a beach or something somewhere. And so I made that, but there's one, at least in the Bishop Museum like this. It's a little bigger than this. But they really, the amount of work that went into to make that out of whalebone was astronomical. So the point of this is that they would train the root of an ohia tree, or possibly a branch, so it went in a curve, or they'd get a curved branch from a tree called koa'e, a relative of koa, but it has real gnarly, twisty branches. And so by doing that, then you ended up with the grain running right down through the curve, so it wouldn't snap. If you made this out of a plank, it would snap right here. But as long as it's grown by a trained root or limb, or a limb that naturally grew that way, it's really, really strong. So they use that cordage called olana up here, and first they'd get a whole bunch of it down this way. So you got all these fibers of olana hanging down this way. Tie it tightly here in the grooves with some more olana. Then turn it over this way and tie it again in the grooves. And then they would weave an 8-ply braid of olana here that went on up for a good ways until it tied to another cord. And so it was incredibly strong. Olana was incredibly tough and strong. And then they would even weave like a Kevlar armor. They'd weave, a warp and a weft of olana threads on here to make a skirt on here. And so the jaw of the shark, the teeth just can't get a hold of this and tear it off or break it off, as with shark hooks all over the world. So the Hawaiian ones were the most sophisticated for both reasons. This and this. That was unique to Hawaii. So we'll get to, maybe when we get to fishing, talking on that subject, talking more about how they caught the sharks. I think I talked about it a little bit before, but real interesting how they caught the sharks and then what they did with the skin and so on. So I think we've pretty much gone through this whole subject, and mahalo.